Imagine this, you're shooting a commercial, but it's not punchy or playful. It's quiet, emotional. There's a certain weight to it. And the challenge isn't just making it look good, it's telling the story right. Because when you're working in the narrative commercial space, the margin of error gets so much tighter. The lighting needs to feel motivated, the lensing has to reflect the emotional tone, and the coverage, it's got to give your editor options without losing the intimacy of the piece. In this video, I'm breaking down how I shot a recent narrative commercial with a more serious tone, and walking through how I approach coverage, lens choices, and lighting setups to serve both the story and the brand. You'll learn how to shoot scenes that feel cinematic and grounded, not staged or overproduced, and how to make subtle creative decisions that carry emotional weight. Because when your cinematography feels invisible, but the audience still feels something, that's when you know you're doing it right. Shooting narrative style commercials is a different kind of challenge. You're working in the middle ground between branded storytelling and a short film. You have a client to satisfy, but you're also building an emotional arc. And that means your coverage, lensing, and lighting have to be so intentional. And it all starts with understanding the story. What's the core message? Who are we following? What do we want the audience to feel in each moment? Once you have that clarity and once you've aligned with your director, that's when you can start designing frames that reflect characters' perspectives, crafting light that mirrors mood shifts, and choosing lenses that help us feel just a little bit closer or even a little bit more distant. It's less about showing off and more about knowing when to hold back, and that is the key when it comes to narrative commercials. I want to dive into a sequence of shots for a recent spec commercial I was a part of and give you the real examples when it comes to these concepts. And the commercial that we're going to be talking about here was a spec commercial for Toyota, and this was developed by my partner who was the director of this, and it gave me a big opportunity to test and really flex when it came to narrative commercial style. When we talk about that narrative commercial style, there's a lot of things that are associated with that, and it's more watching and then getting closer and then being in that as well. And there's a lot of special things when it comes to a narrative commercial style because there is just so much more associated with it. It gets a little bit more complex than regular commercials because you have to tell the story right. You have to hit those emotional beats. So when we talk about the intro of this entire piece, and that's what all the shots that we're going to be covering right now, I really want to talk about the emotions and what we're supposed to necessarily feel here and where we're supposed to be as a viewer. So when we talk about this first opening shot, we want to utilize the landscape and location that we are dealing with. So we really lucked out on this location because we just rented this pond that was next to a house that was out in the middle of nowhere. And in this morning when we did our location scout, we knew exactly where the sun was going to be and everything. But the thing is, the only thing that we couldn't predict is the fog that rolled in, and it gave the exact feeling that the director was looking for. So moody, and it just easily pushed what we're looking for. So if we talk about the camera here, we're using the Sony Venice. And this was paired with the Arliss Primes, and at this point I'm using a 40mm, and then I'm shooting at a T2.8 at this case. Because we're so far away, your T-stop really doesn't matter. But again, the reason why I chose a 40mm for a wide shot and not something like a 25 is because I wanted to give that watching feeling. I still wanted to showcase everything that was happening, what is happening between the two characters, my beautiful landscape, but I didn't want to show off too much that was going on. And that's the really point of having narrative commercials, especially when you're doing the wide shots. I like to call them almost telephoto wides. I don't know exactly what the proper terminology is because I generally like to use something 40, 50, 75, or even 85 to get wide shots because it gives you that compression and really gives you that watching perspective. So this is kind of the in between here of something that could feel a little bit wide as well as telephoto. And then when we talk about the composition here, there's two things that I really want to drive the interest into the frame. We have this little house and a little shack over here that was just a boathouse that we used as a real house. And then we have our one of our supporting talent coming out here. And then we have our main talent over here who is a swimmer. And then her mom is basically telling her, please come inside. So when we talk about our general composition, I am putting my two subjects in the rule of thirds, and that is just the most interesting, especially with the isolation that is happening over here. It's a little bit busy with what's going on in terms of seeing what's happening over here, but it's actually not that really interesting because what we're trying to focus on is Isabella's here, isolation, and that's the main thing that this tells with that, because she is framed beautifully inside this lake and there's nothing necessarily to distract her, and this tells us that maybe something is potentially going to happen here, and it kind of foreshadows like what are we exactly exploring in this commercial. Then when we talk about the cinematography side of things, about lighting, we just had these practical lights that were on, but I wanted to push this further on the inside, so I just used 2 Infinibars set to 3200 Kelvin, and these are at 100%. And then you can see that this is kind of like a 2-story thing, and then we see it with some orange highlight here as well as down here. And I just set this in the corner shooting into the actual room, and then we set one upstairs just laying on the bed or something up there, and this is shooting up, bouncing the light everywhere. I didn't want to necessarily be direct and you see it. I usually like to bounce it off a wall, and it gives you that soft look that is associated with like evening tones, and like it's lit by practicals, and the practicals outside really help that, as well as these lights here. And then when we talk about contrasting colors, we have that classic orange and teal look, and that is associated with the white balance that I'm shooting this at. So I was actually shooting at a white balance of 4400 Kelvin. This is what I just generally like to use because it generally pushes my daylight or anything that is assuming a little bit more white to blue, and then it really punches up the orange sources that I'm using because that is set all the way down to 3200 Kelvin. So that is my kind of my cheat code when it comes to really developing color contrast without using a lot of lights. And then the next shot that we have here is I did not swap at any of my lenses when it came to this because I didn't have a lot of time to get this proper coverage of the scene because the fog was moving, and then we didn't only had a limited amount of time in this pond. I believe we only had an hour, and then we had to get a lot of shots to get just the variance of everything and get the proper coverage of the scene. When it comes to narrative commercials, I really like to prioritize the coverage and getting the proper shots rather than trying to light everything. So I kind of had to build a really modular lighting kit, which was just the 2 Infinibars and then using negative fill as well as a bounce. So when we talk about here, again, we're on the Venice. And then we are using the 40mm again. And then I'm shooting at an aperture of 2.8. The reason why I'm shooting at that high of a t-stop relative to these lenses, because they can go down to 1.3, is because I want the whole face in focus, and I'm not looking for something that is supposed to be very dreamlike. It is very narrative commercial. She has enough separation from the background. I don't need to blow this out anymore because it's going to take away from the emotional arc of the piece. So in this point of the sequence, she's saying, "Please come inside, it's cold." And then Isabella responds with like, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm just going to do one more, then I'll be inside." So right here, I have all my light coming in here, and it is naturally diffused just with all the fog that is happening and just the clouds. So I didn't necessarily have to diffuse anything or walk in a bounce or anything like that. I had a neg on standby, but because the house was there, it was already acting as a neg and soaking up a lot of that light and not bouncing any back. So that gave me the contrast ratio that we kind of developed for the entire piece and the entire commercial, because we weren't looking for anything that was too much. We weren't looking for anything that was too contrasty and it was too much for exactly what we're trying to do. We wanted that soft contrast and a low contrast ratio when we go over the face especially. And then when you look at, you know, what makes an image cinematic, again, we have the light and dark parts of the image, and that's totally fine. But you notice here we don't necessarily have a catch light, and that's something that you could add. But because if we go back to context of what we're talking about here, there's no light source that is really doing that. But I remember we shot one of the last ones and not necessarily the first, and you can see that we don't have a lot of that orange coming back. And then I could have added a simple backlight to really connect the two scenes. And this is kind of a mistake that I made, but it's not really noticeable because the shots are so quick. The main thing that I want to go here is proper coverage and not necessarily continuity when it comes to lighting. But again, I could have just popped a little MC or somebody hold something while we got the shot to see her popped out with some orange in the back. But again, that might feel a little unnatural when we really talk about what's coming inside and her separation from the house itself. So it could kind of go either way. You just have to kind of really see it on a monitor and feel what feels right. and see what feels right. I feel like that's the most important thing, and you have to trust your gut when you're going with these things. So we bounce back between coverage of the mother and Isabella. The other shot isn't necessarily too pleasing or anything like that. It was more serving a story piece. And the main thing that I want to talk about is how we achieve these swimming shots, because you see this shot here where we're level with the water, and the next shot that you see an underwater perspective. So this all goes with proper timing and proper location management. The director and I actually scouted this location, and then a big worry that we both had was like, yes, we're shooting in a natural pond, but it is going to be murky, so we don't actually see what is going on, and that's just having us experience swimming in any lake and everything like that and be realistic. So we talked to a producer and be like, hey, because we're not going to be able to get this underwater shot that really helps move the piece forward and doesn't feel like the same shot over and over again, we're going to need a pool. And then the producer's like, oh, that's a lot of money. Then Sofia had the bright idea, can we get a second location where we're going to shoot all the house shots and have a pool there and just shoot it at night so we don't see as much? If you really look at it back to back and everything and really analyze it, you can tell that it's not the same, and there's a lot of lights going on and everything like that. But it really helps serve the story and drives that necessarily forward. And again, this was a spec commercial, so we did the best we could with the budget that we had. But if we go back to this shot, again, I didn't change my lens throughout this entire thing. And then you could say like, oh, well, everything feels the same. But because the shots are so different in terms of what is telling and being told in the story, as well as this water shot, you can get away with using the same lens and it's no problem. If I needed to really punch in and get something that felt tighter, obviously not changing the lens dynamics or anything like that, I would just crop in and shoot 4K instead of 6K if we wanted something to feel different. And then I just would tell the director, and she's really aligned with that in terms of like, hey, we can just punch in if you want this to feel different. And that's usually what happens with narrative commercials, because it happens all the time. But again, we're shooting on the 40 mil and everything like that. But what I did is I bought a fish tank from Amazon, and then I simply put some towels underneath, and then we have our camera as well as a matte box pushed right up against the glass so we don't get any reflections. And then this is my terrible drawing of a camera, and that's in there. And then what we also did is, because I knew that this would be taking up so much space, because you can imagine a Sony Venice in a fish tank, and yes, the camera's heavy, but it doesn't have enough weight and it was too buoyant. So what I did is we put a 25-pound sandbag in the front, and then I just took and hold the sides over here, and then used it as it was floating and just pushed it down where it needed to be. And this worked out great. The person who really introduced it, I know so many people have done it, but I know Jacob Owens is really known for this. Just buy a fish tank on Amazon, whatever size camera that you have. We had to buy a really big one to do this, and it worked perfectly because it puts us at the surface of the water and it gives us a lot more interest. If I was just standing in there and just holding the camera above water, it wouldn't feel as grand as it did, because when we are with the level of the water, we get the horizon and the trees in the background, and it just really tells what we're trying to do. Again, in the story, this is a traumatic experience. The main character it happens and relives on a day-to-day basis because of her fear of water, of her almost drowning. So we really wanted this scene to be important. I was really aligning with the director, and we were like, hey, we want to make this feel as dramatic as possible. I want to be in there when this is happening. So how can we do that? And the good old fish tank trick. If I really wanted to do this properly, you'd get a full cine housing for this, my Venice, or even I could just get a housing for the FX3 and everything like that. And we just didn't have the time and budget to do that. So the good old fish tank trick worked a treat for this. And then when we go into the next shot, this was something that we actually needed a housing for, because the director really wanted the shot of basically the camera sitting on the bottom and having that perspective of her going across frame. So I'm like, perfect, we can do that in a pool in the location. So if we draw this pool, that's what we're kind of looking at here. And then I have a lot of swimming experience just because I did competitive swimming for like 14 years of my life, funny fact. But I was very comfortable underwater. I had no problem doing this. The problem was that we were using the Sea Frogs enclosure for the Sony FX3 plus an 18 to 35 millimeter lens, just because of the requirements of the underwater housing. that's the only lens that you can necessarily put in there. And then we weren't really concerned about it because it's in water. I don't need to use this on prime. And then also I can't put a focus motor on anything. So if we talk about the enclosure and what it looks like, this is kind of the Sony FX3, and there's the lens, and then it just kind of tightly fits around, and it gives a bigger lens and body to the whole thing, as well as there's this big dome on the front with a hood. So it just protects the lens as well as it just keeps it proper. And that just protects the lens. So now the problem is that when you have something that's supposed to be airtight, it just wants to float. You can suck out all the air, and like we're trying to do that, but it is still floating. So what we ended up doing to put this on the bottom is I used 2 sandbags, and then the straps of the sandbags were wrapped around the camera. And then the camera is pointing up. So basically we only had to get this one shot here, and that was really telling the story. So I kind of had to set it up, and then the swimmer went back and forth here, and then that would give us the shot that we're looking for. But this is the funny thing about filmmaking, because you're never going to know what is necessarily going to happen when you shoot on location to location. So in an ideal world, we would have shot all the stuff on the lake first and got all the inserts there, and then moved to the house and shot that on a separate day. But just due to location timing and scheduling, and then working with a bunch of different people, we had access to the house first, and then we would have to shoot the lake scenes afterwards. So I was expecting we would be shooting this at sunrise, the sun would be beaming through, and then we would have that skipping across the lake. But realistically, that didn't happen. It was foggy. Remember that? So I had to light the scene with preemptively thinking of what the next scene would look like, and that's almost impossible to do, because if I set a look here and it's not continuous with the other look, then you're going to be like, what the heck? And that is kind of the mistake that I made here, because we have this bright source of light right here, and that is from a 600C with a Fresnel pointed down and kind of giving us a backlight into this here. So this is set to 4,000 Kelvin. And then I had this at a low percentage, like 5%. I didn't even need that much, just because of how it worked through the water. This gave us a lot of texture, and I don't even know how interesting I would light this if it was supposed to match with the other scenes as well, just because we weren't dealing with any light. And that's still something that, you know, really I have to think about when it comes to cinematography, especially water stuff. This was my first time dealing with water, and I feel like we did a really good job, but there's still things that I can improve on. But this just gives you a bunch of texture, and it looks nice, and what we deem as cinematic in terms of the edge light that we get on her, and then also the shadows that are developed by that, just due to the contrast of everything that we're looking for. When we look at this in terms of a cinematography point of view, it is correct. But when we look at continuity in terms of what this looks like, yes, the colors did an amazing job in terms of matching it and making it a little darker, but then there is no sun that is existent. So you're gonna kind of be like, ooh, that feels a little bit weird. So that's something I would try to improve on in the future, but there's only so much that you can plan for. And the next shot that we're gonna be looking at is the actual drowning experience. So we had basically this happen both in the lake as well as in the pool, because we wanted to see this actually happen as she sink, and you know, we're in that moment and we're feeling exactly what's necessarily going on. So we kind of had 2 options here, and we shot them both in the lake as well as in the pool, because we wanted to see underwater, and that was the main thing. And again, we have the same setup here, but you can see why I exactly did this to make it look great. And then when we get back into the pool and we talk about the shot, you can see exactly why I did this with the light. So it gives me these streaks of light that are coming through the water that just are very pleasing, and what we talk about when we try to make something that is cinematic or looks good. We're talking about salt and pepper, or a checkerboard of light and dark parts across your entire image. Even when we talk about her foot over here, or even the highlights on her swimsuit, as well as down here, over here, and then the split lighting that we have on her face that is very dramatic. It's not necessarily coming over across. It is very contrasty. This is very dramatic because this is a dramatic scene. So that's exactly why I lit this like this. And then this is the first shot that I based everything off of, not necessarily the one that is just pointing up because it's kind of flat and there's not much going on there, but that is an important shot to drive the story forward. But again, we're using the same lighting setup, same thing as well. We just had her swim into frame and then kind of slow and stop, as well as do some thrashing of what was necessarily going on in terms of this. So what we had her do is kind of swim into frame while I'm there, kind of slowly pushing in with the camera, and then we have her thrashing around and like she is going through this event where she basically stops breathing and then she's almost drowning. So we're trying to do this in the pool as well as do it in the lake with the thrashing and everything that we're going to go around, because then we can give something the editor to cut to. In addition to this, I did some whips as well as shot this in slow shutter just to give the editor as much as possible, especially when it came to this, because we wanted fast cuts to make this as dramatic as possible. So again, this is again on the 40 mil with the Venice, and then I'm just floating around as she's just kind of splashing around, and the director is giving her basically the direction of what we want here. But the thing what was really good here is because in the next shot we cut to an adult version of Isabella, and this was a really creative thing that the director wanted to do in terms of really connecting these two scenes. Like, how do you go from a childhood traumatic experience to something that is happening in your adulthood and something that you live with constantly? And this was a brilliant idea by Sofia specifically, because we had her basically washing her face and then she wanted that perspective. And this is the thing I love about working with my partner, especially because she challenges me in these things when it comes to creating shots that are very hard and technical to pull off. And it just gives me the opportunity to do that, because then I just get really excited to pull these things off. So when we talk about these shots here, because these are cut back in the sequence, we see Isabella basically gasping for breath here. And at this point, she is pulling her face out of the water, and we're not necessarily sitting here for a long period of time. She's like gasping for air at this point. And it's a very good way to transition into what we're living in for the rest of the commercial, which is her adult life. So the way that we did this one is, again, we use that same fish tank that we used for the outdoor scenes. So I didn't use the fish tank at this point because we shot all the in-house stuff first. So how do you achieve something like this? And we used a fish tank to do this as well. And this, we had to get very creative because there's a lot going on and we didn't have a lot of resources. So again, I didn't even shoot the on lake stuff with the fish tank in the water because we shot all this stuff in-house. So this is the first shot that we actually got on the day when it came to the house and the coverage that we're getting there, because if you think about it, she's going to be submerging her face in water, and then we couldn't have any hair and makeup done because all the oil and everything from the face would just, as well as her makeup, would run, and then ultimately you'd see it on the top surface of the water. So we had to kind of strategically do this and set up as quick as possible, shoot the shot, and then get her process to do everything else. So again, we're using that fish tank, and this was actually in the kitchen, which was hilarious. So this is our fish tank here, and then we're sitting this on like a kitchen island, and then using a bunch of apple boxes for our talent to stand on, and then she's kind of dunking her head in here. Sorry, that is a terrible drawing. And then she is dunking her head in here with that surface above the water. So if I kind of draw this, she's like standing like this. Sorry, I'm not a good illustrator when it comes to these things, but you guys can get the point. And then I'm shooting on a super low angle here. So this is my camera. And then I want this to feel as compressed as possible. So this was shooting on the Venice. And then I believe this shot was on the 75mm. And then I'm shooting at an aperture of T2.8. And then I have my white balance set here to 4400 Kelvin because I just knew that I wanted to push this a little bit more blue, because you can see that kind of blue tone in the water itself, and we're shooting this on daylight. And this was kind of really easy to pull off because I just had to use a lot of black material. So we have a floppy leaned up here, then we have a floppy on the side, and then we have a floppy in the front so we don't see any reflections and we're just kind of looking down the barrel. And then we had a lot of also a floppy on top of here to kind of skirt off the top so we didn't have a lot of light spilling in. And then because there's a window behind us on the side over here, we had a bunch of natural light coming in, so I didn't actually necessarily have to light this. This was all natural light. I believe I had an F22 on standby, but I don't think I actually used it. but that natural light was just naturally coming in here and then giving me a perfect lighting when we talk about what makes an image cinematic and what we talk about when we're looking at light on somebody's face. I have light Rembrandt lighting here, and then a pleasing contrast ratio when we look across the face. And again, we're kind of matching the same contrast ratio that we had here in our first shot. And this is kind of something I wanted to keep consistent across the piece. So this is kind of me setting the look for the entire piece, because this is the first shot that we did of the entire commercial, and then going on and keeping that continuity as we went on. But again, different scenarios had different contrast ratios to give you that emotion. When we talk about the shot and aligning it with the director, it's really important to align with the time of day. This was the morning, and it was basically as she's getting her daughter ready for school, and then we were going for that necessarily morning look to match with the next shot in the sequence of her basically coming up and taking a breath of fresh air. So I really want to go over the sequence of shots, especially when it comes to the emotional tone of things and what lensing and compositional choices to use, especially when you're trying to get that story across and hit those hard moments, especially when it comes to a piece that is so well written when it comes to such a traumatic experience. So I really hope this helps you guys when it comes to your narrative, commercials, and anything that you're planning, and starts really turning the gears when it comes to being more intentional with your work.